Afternoon, everybody. So I work for the Canadian Association of Forest Owners. I was here a couple of years ago. And just a quick introduction to the organization. We represent the largest landowners, forest landowners in Canada. There are about a dozen companies, a bunch that you know in this part of the world, but some in Ontario and British Columbia as well. And so we represent those largest owners. We work very closely with woodlot associations across Canada, including the Canadian Federation of Woodlot Owners, and we work with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. So between those three organizations, we probably represent 90% of the private land in Canada. So I want to talk to you today about fishing wildlife and how I think those are going to be the biggest influences on how we manage forests already starting now. So maybe that's obvious observation, I don't know. But just wondering, so I'm guessing pretty much everyone here is connected to the industry. Somebody, like a lot of you will own your own land. A lot of you will work for folks who own land, crown land, contractors. But how many of you own a cat? Cat owners, okay. So between forestry and cats, we're all going to jail. So there are several billion birds from over 400 species that breed each year in Canada. Based on a 2013 study on bird mortality, about 269 million birds and about 2 million nests, or the equivalent of 186 million breeding individuals, are destroyed each year by human activity. The death of birds is not spread equally across the country. Not surprisingly, the most densely populated areas are the places where most of the deaths occur. So that's places like Southern Ontario, Alberta, and Southwest BC. 95% of those deaths are caused by domestic and feral cats and collisions with buildings, vehicles, and transmission lines. 95%. So, what's your guess on how many birds are killed by industrial forestry activity? Anybody want to throw out a number, like a percentage of that total? What do you think?
3%.
3%, that's a good one. Anyone else? No? Okay. So the report estimates that about 888,000 birds are killed with industrial forestry activity, which adds up to 0.5%, half of 1%. So I like to put these numbers in a little bit more digestible kind of units. So if we say there's 100 dead birds killed every year by human activity. So of those 100, 72 are killed by birds. Another 9 are killed by power lines. 5 more by buildings and 5 more by vehicle strikes. And of the 5 that are left, so that's 95 of those 100 birds. The 5 that are left, 1 is killed by hunting, and less than 2 are killed by a combination of agricultural activity and forestry activity. And then there's another 2 or 3 that are killed by fisheries, oil and gas, and a couple of other activities. So this report I mentioned said that the quantification of the magnitude of human-related avian mortality is essential for directing management and conservation activities. And I couldn't agree more. So we need to know where we direct our management and conservation efforts. So who do we go after? Should cat owners be charged? What about controlling cat populations? Here's a number. 135.5 million birds killed by cats. In the US, 2.4 billion. What about building owners? 16.4 million birds. US, 303.5 million. But no, the focus is that 0.5% industrial forestry activity in Canada. I'm not aware of an equivalent effort or focus on agriculture, but I think most of you would know, you don't mess with farmers. This is a sign from just outside of Ottawa. Government back off. This is our land. So there are, so back to my first point. We're going to jail, right? I mentioned that. And there are several federal and provincial laws to prevent and minimize mortality. There's the Provincial and Federal Species at Risk Acts. There's the Migratory Birds Convention Act, which prohibits any disturbance or destruction of birds, eggs, nests, or parts of nests, including nests on the roof of a private home, sitting on your lawn, inside a garage, lying in a driveway or on a public road, even broken or unused nests. It has a very broad definition of what migratory birds are and includes hundreds of very common species. These aren't endangered, these are just migratory birds. There's no allowances for inadvertently killing a bird or destroying a nest, and you can be carrying out perfectly legal activities like forest harvesting or mowing your lawn. So up until recently, compliance with these laws was done through promotion, providing information about things like breeding seasons and migratory periods, all intended to minimize the risk of inadvertent destruction. That changed when several organizations started looking more closely at the Migratory Birds Convention Act and realized that anyone disturbing or destroying birds, nests, eggs was in contravention of the Act, and therefore subject to substantial fines and even jail time. Any take, as it's called in the Act, incidental or otherwise, can carry penalties up to $1 million and 3 years in prison. And any director or agent of a corporation can be held liable. This past August, a real estate development company from Montreal's South Shore pleaded guilty to destroying between 25 and 55 migratory bird nests as a result of clearing operations back in June 2016. They received a $20,000 fine and 1 year's probation. They were required to publish an offense notice in a construction industry magazine to raise awareness about the importance of protecting migratory birds. Last year, a lodge in Banff National Park was fined $27,000 after maintenance staff removed and destroyed an egg and 4 barn swallow nests. In early July, this past summer, Environment Canada was investigating an alleged case of mass cliff swallow nest destruction at a resort in Osoyoos, BC. This was initiated after a complaint from the BC SPCA, and the resort manager has denied that any damage had happened to these birds. Closer to home for you guys, in July, the Nova Scotia Ecology Action Centre sent a letter to Environment and Climate Change Canada, or ECCC as we call it, and the Nova Scotia Minister of Lands and Forestry, requesting an investigation of potential offences under the Migratory Birds Convention Act. The Ecology Action Centre asked them to ensure that no harvesting occurred while protecting birds that were breeding. The breeding season, by the way, in this part of the world is from the end of March to the end of August. Volunteers with the Ecology Action Centre, using the Canadian Wildlife Service's own nest research techniques, identified 31 bird species exhibiting breeding behaviors. ECCC will need to respond to that letter, and I don't imagine they're likely to start telling the Nova Scotia government how to manage forests on Crown land. At the same time, they can't ignore the letter. So this increase in the use of the Migratory Birds Convention Act is going to force ECCC to consider many of the ideas that CAFO, our organization, has been talking about for several years. Things like best management practices, corrective actions, and allowances for incidental take. The Act has the word convention in it, Migratory Birds Convention Act. This is because it was originally assigned as a convention between Great Britain and the US. Canada was still a colony of Great Britain back in 1916, so Great Britain signed on behalf of Canada, and it was a convention to protect migratory birds from extermination by controlling unregulated hunting and indiscriminate slaughter, mostly for feathers for hats. Despite this international aspect of the legislation, the US takes a very different approach. In December of 2017, an interpretation of their Migratory Bird Treaty Act said that pursuing, hunting, taking, capturing, killing, or attempting to do the same is illegal only if that is the intended purpose. If it isn't the intended purpose, then it's considered incidental and not a criminal activity. The ruling also identified the need for the Department of the Interior, which is the organization of the states that manages their legislation. So the Department of the Interior needs to engage in rulemaking to consider a regulatory approach to the incidental taking of migratory birds. We've been after Environment Canada for the same regulatory approach and to create provisions to allow for incidental take. So far that's fallen on deaf ears. Here's what we say about Migratory Bird Convention Act. We've emphasized that forestry is not the problem. I mentioned that. They need to deal with cats, they need to deal with buildings, not the sector that causes 0.5% of the bird mortality in Canada. We let them know that tremendous efforts take place by the industry to avoid damage to birds and habitat. Finally, we've asked them to support the development of regulations within the Act that will allow for incidental take, recognizing that mistakes happen and that when they do, we take corrective action. In June, Environment Canada circulated proposed changes to the regulations under the Migratory Bird Convention Act to recognize some Indigenous rights and to allow for the destruction of nests if they are shown to be unused for 3 years. In other words, you have to keep an eye on those nests out in your operations for 3 years. If they're unused, you're allowed to request a permit to destroy them. 3 years. It's interesting, they said they're not going to consider options for incidental take. We, along with organizations like the Forest Products Association of Canada, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, the BC Association of Private Forest Landowners, have all submitted the submissions to Environment Canada to talk about the changes to these regulations and to emphasize the need for incidental take. So anyway, that's some stuff about birds, but there's more, unfortunately. There's the Species at Risk Act. So we've been raising concerns about this legislation for several years now, and we let them know that private forest land is managed, well managed, and therefore productive for a whole bunch of things, including water, recreation, wildlife fisheries, and of course trees. So when these benefits are provided to society from public land, we all pay for them. When those same benefits come from private land, it's the landowner that pays. So we seek recognition under the, in the same way that the New Brunswick Species at Risk Act talks about it, where the Act says that you need to identify critical habitat first on public land, and if more is required, then you go to private land, but you go with the knowledge and consent of the owner. The recognition of the public benefits provided by private land can take many forms. It can include compensation and other financial incentives, regulatory certainty, and conservation credits, and maybe even the occasional, hey guys, thanks very much, you're doing a great job. So we bring those messages mainly to Environment Canada and Fisheries and Oceans, but other departments as well through several access points. One of them is the Species at Risk Advisory Committee, or SARAC. The CAFO has been a member of SARAC for about 3 years now, and this committee advises the Ministers of Fisheries and Oceans and the Minister of Environment and Climate Change on how to improve outcomes for species at risk. SARAC has 30 members. There are 12 industry associations and 14 environmental groups and 4 Indigenous organizations. So if you're wondering about that imbalance, 12 industry versus 14 environmental. Two of the environmental organizations are SFI and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association. So they're very much aligned with this notion of maintaining economic competitiveness and healthy markets. So there's a really good balance on that committee. SARAC advocated for multi-species and ecosystem approaches to species at risk, and this is at least partially responsible for the government developing what's called the Pan-Canadian approach. The Pan-Canadian approach provides us with another access point for making our species at risk arguments. This approach has identified priority places, priority sectors, priority species, and priority threats. Forestry, along with agriculture and urban development, are the priority sectors. Now, we've been working with FPAC to provide access to the forest sector, so between FPAC and ourselves, that's a pretty large chunk of the forest sector in Canada. Environment Canada has, along with the provinces, has agreed on 11 priority places across Canada. This is the map, the priority place, and you can see a few locations in this part of the world, including the St. John River Valley. And the priority species are caribou, and more caribou. They included sage, grouse, and wood bison, I think, just to mix it up a bit. And the priority threats are wildlife disease, illegal wildlife trade, and invasive species. CAFO signed an MOU with Environment Canada back in 2016, and we've been working with SFI to describe sustainable forestry in general and explain how forest certification works and can be used to demonstrate protection under the Species at Risk Act. This work has really helped to educate our friends at Environment Canada about what's involved in forestry first, how wildlife and species at risk are considered, and how certification and third-party audits can provide independent verification of that work. Environment Canada themselves have told us that because of our pilot projects, and there's one here in New Brunswick with Bay Irving and one on Vancouver Island with Timber West, because of the pilot projects, they've changed their attitude towards forestry and how they approach the forest sector. So I think that in itself is an accomplishment. As a result of the pilot projects, SFI has developed a species at risk module for their certification standard, and it was field tested this past summer. The draft is now out and available for public review, and it's on their website as well if you want to take a look at it. Another way that CAFO gains an opportunity to learn and share our views on species at risk is through the National Forest Sector Roundtable. This group includes several FPAC member companies, provincial forest industry associations, and CAFO. Excuse me. We share information on what's happening across jurisdictions, learn about issues of concern with FPAC companies on public land, and share our efforts on private land. The Roundtable has been watching the CAFO pilot project closely with the hope that the species at risk module from SFI can be applied to both public and private land, and will have to serve a whole bunch of different purposes. I mentioned invasive species as one of the priority threats identified by Environment Canada. Another avenue for CAFO to engage on species at risk is through the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. We joined their board in 2018 and have participated in their Invasive Species Forum this past year. Invasive species are not only a priority threat as far as Environment Canada is concerned, they're also a pretty serious concern for forest owners as well. Invasive species tend to show up close to population centers, which are key entry points. And as you probably well know, most private forest land is located close to population centers as well, and tend to be the first places where invasive species start to show up. So we're looking forward to learning more and contributing to a national effort to control invasives through our work with the Canadian Council. So that's some of the stuff that's going on with wildlife. Of course, then there's fisheries. As most of you will know, the federal government introduced changes to the Fisheries Act in order to strengthen loss protections that the previous Conservative government removed from the Act. This is the language of the Liberal government. Restore loss protections. CAFO story is that the Fisheries Act was that we support most of the changes that they've introduced to the Fisheries Act. And our view is that healthy fisheries habitat is an indication of healthy forests. Healthy forests grow healthy trees, which is a successful business. We encouraged engagement with the forest sector. This is when we were talking about the changes to the Fisheries Act. A focus on results rather than process, and the notion that risk assessment should govern how the government responds to an activity. In other words, the greater the risk, the more scrutiny an activity should garner. We encourage DFO to work closely with the provinces and create a single point of entry for fisheries legislation, so that you're not going to the province for one thing and then going to the feds for something else, or maybe the same thing but with a different group of folks. We emphasize that man-made structures should not be considered fish habitat, and we advocated for clear and transparent language so landowners can understand what's expected of them. Finally, we asked that they invest in stewardship programs to build partnerships and encourage the right kind of behavior through cooperation and incentives rather than through punitive activities. To bring these messages forward, we provided a submission to the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, and our chairman, who's on the left there, Domenico Yanni Gennaro, he's chief forester with Timber West out on Vancouver Island. He appeared before the Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans to share some of our ideas. We regularly meet with the DFO and join conference calls and other sessions hosted by DFO on changes to the Act and regulations. We're encouraged to see that the definition of fish habitat did not include man-made structures. Like you create a ditch and it's wet in the springtime, dry in the summer, it's not fish habitat. That enforcement of the Act will be based on risk, and that DFO is developing codes of practice to help guide activities near fish habitat. And they've asked us to help participate in developing those codes of practice. Mm-hmm. Our most recent efforts are related to the federal election. We've been working very closely with the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and the Canadian Federation of Woodlot Owners to raise concerns of both farmers and woodlot owners and the larger companies as well. Our three organizations that I mentioned represent about 90% of the rural landowners in Canada. We meet regularly with MPs and party policymakers to raise our concerns and have them consider those as part of the election platforms. And I would encourage you all to do the same. It's really important if you have a chance to talk to your local candidates, because they like to hear from potential voters and constituents. And if it's coming from the local folks to the local candidate, it has a lot more impact. They hear tons of stuff from national bodies like ours, but coming from those people who live in their ridings is a really important effort. And there's lots of things that they're bombarded with from their parties. You've seen the lists of the platforms from the different parties, and if we can get some forestry issues in and being considered, I think that's a really important step. So that's what we're doing on fish, on birds, on other issues. And if you're interested, here's my contact information. If you're interested in joining us, if you're interested in learning more, if you're interested in just asking some questions about what we're up to and what we're trying to do, by all means let me know. I'll be here today and tomorrow. So thanks very much. And I don't know, Peter, where are you? Questions or?
Any quick questions for Chris?
I hate it when there's no questions.
You referenced what the report was that a lot of the data came from?
Yes. Did I not mention it?
You mentioned it, but I've forgotten already.
It's in here somewhere. Yeah, it was published in Bird Studies Canada in 2013. If you've got a card, I can send you the reference so you can look it up. Fascinating study, actually. Yes, sir.
What birds are breeding in August besides the American goldfinch?
Oh, I don't know, but that's what we're told. Mid-March to mid-August is the breeding season. Yeah.
Oh, it's out of the end of July, mid-July.
Yeah. Well, and as you are probably correctly pointing out, that it varies from species. It varies from different parts of the country, and you know the climate and that stuff. But I'm not an expert on birds. I couldn't tell you.
Seems like it is a broad brush.
Yeah. Well, dealing with Environment Canada, there's a tendency to take a very safety first approach, if that's the right way to put it. That let's, if there's critical habitat, let's protect more. If there's a breeding season, let's make it a little bit longer. Just to make sure we've got everything covered. It's a very cautionary approach, I guess, would be the right way to put it.
Chris, on behalf of the group, thank you very much for
Okay.
joining us here this afternoon.